Okay, so I've just finished making the chicken pie base, and I said to you I'd show you how to make the pastry to go on top of it if you're interested. I didn't actually add any seasoning to the chicken pie, so what I did with it is I've put some pepper in it, black pepper. You can obviously put any herbs, spices you'd like. I tend not to use much salt in my cooking, that's down to personal taste. So to make pastry you need some flour, preferably plain, although if you're at a push self-raising would work, and you need some butter or block margarine, or if that you haven't got either of those, then something like stalk margarine would work as well, the softer margarine. The basic principle of pastry making is that you need half the amount of fat to the amount of flour you use. So if I was going to use 150 grams of flour, I'd use 75 grams of the butter or margarine. For this I'm using 120 grams of the flour, and so that means I've put 60 grams of butter in. The next thing I do once I've weighed carefully is to coat the butter in the flour, rolling it all over, and then taking a knife that you use to butter your bread, I'm just cutting this into fairly small chunks because I'm going to do the rubbing in method in a minute, which means that you're going to make breadcrumbs, fine breadcrumbs, by getting the fat, butter and the flour combined together. I'm trying to not get too much heat from my hands into this butter because that will melt it, and if I melt it, it will all just stick together and become overworked. It won't be what I'm after. So I'm just chopping this down into little chunks. And once that's done, I'm going to use my fingertips and my thumbs to rub in. To do this properly, there we are, it's the last little bit there. To do this properly, I'm going to lift up some flour and fat in my fingers and just rub the fat with the flour in my hands over my thumbs, or over my fingers with my thumbs is probably the right way around, isn't it? As I let it drop down, because I'm not wanting to melt the butter, I make sure that I go from somewhere slightly different to pick up the next bit of fat so that I'm not constantly working the same bit of fat. I'm also trying to get any bits of flour from the bottom of the bowl. Now this might take a minute or two depending on how hard your butter or margarine is. If you're working with soft margarine, then you need to do this very quickly because it will go very, very quickly. I'm looking to make breadcrumbs with this. If I overwork it, the mixture will become yellowy in colour. The flour will look greyish yellowy colour, at which point I must stop, otherwise I won't need to add water and it won't be pastry. Could do this in a food processor, makes very quick work of it. More washing up there. When you think you're nearly there, you give the bowl a full-on shake and any large lumps of butter rise to the surface. I know it's not there yet, but to give you show you what it looks like. And any of the large lumps come straight to the surface, so I know that they're the bits I've got to work in still. So very quickly going to do that. Now I've got some cold water on standby and a tablespoon. Now depending on how much flour and fat you use will depend on how much water you will need, but your water does need to be cold. Everything with pastry making is always cold. Still see a few lumps in there. I can also feel it starting to melt, so I'm going to hold it there in a minute. That's not too bad. Then I'm going to take the cold water and a tablespoon, and I'm going to be adding, I'll start off, bear in mind I've got 120 grams of flour and 80 grams of fat. I'm going to start with about 3.5, maybe 4 tablespoons because I'm not getting full tablespoons there. Using the knife again I used to cut my butter up, I just stir it around. And I'm looking for some biggish lumps to form. And for most of the flour to be incorporated in those lumps. I don't want to see masses of flour, so I can see at the moment that there is some lumps forming, but there's still an awful lot of flour around the edges here. So I'm going to add another tablespoon of water. and I'm going to mix again. Now remember, with the water you can always add more, but you can't take it out. And if you have to add lots more flour, you affect your ratio. So try to add your water gradually. You can see that this is just about there actually. So there's some quite nice big lumps formed, which is great. That's what I'm after. So I go in with my hand and carefully bring this together. Pastry is not bread dough, so do not knead it. Do resist that urge to knead this. It is not a dough, it's a pastry. I'm bringing it together nice and lightly. And then put it onto a surface that's clean. And then I'm going to put a little bit of flour down because it's a little bit sticky, just a little bit. And a little bit of flour on the top of the pastry. Then take your rolling pin and you're going to roll backwards and forwards and stop. Try and be even in the pressure that you apply, otherwise you end up with your pastry high on one side, low on the other. You take your pastry, make sure it's not sticking on the bottom underneath it, and do a quarter of a turn. So it was facing this way, quarter of a turn means it's going to face this way. I'm going to add just a little bit more flour to the top, and if it starts sticking I shall add a little bit more flour underneath. And then it's quite simple, you just roll out and you're aiming for the thickness of a pound coin. So where it's starting to stick, I'm going to stop and hold it there. Put a little bit more flour down. If it starts sticking to the rolling pin, then where it gets stuck on the rolling pin, it sticks every time it rolls over any bit of pastry. So you want to avoid that at all costs. Sticky on that little edge there. Put it down on there. So I've now got my chicken pie that I made earlier on standby. I'm going to check that this is going to cover it. So if I have a look at this, I can see that it's going to go all the way over the top of that chicken pie. So I take a pastry brush. If you haven't got a pastry brush, you can use your finger to do this. Take a little bit of the water, just go around the edge to make your pie dish lip, the rim of it here, wet. You then roll your pastry over the top of your rolling pin very lightly and unroll it over the top of your pie dish, and it should hopefully cover it. You then press down around the edges so that it makes a seal where you've put that water. So I'm pressing it down. You could crimp if you liked. I'm just going to press it down. Take the knife that you used for the butter, butter knife that you used a bit earlier, holding your pie dish, use the back of the knife to just make a up and down motion to cut off any extra pastry. Now this is going to go into the oven, I think I said probably about 180 degree fan, gas mark 5, but before it goes in you need to do a couple of little jobs. One is to make a little hole in the middle, or two little holes in the middle, right through the pastry so that you can see the filling inside so that any steam can escape. And the second thing that you need to do is to glaze this. Now I'm going to use the same pastry brush, save on washing up, and I'm going to take my water out that I used earlier and replace it with about a tablespoon of milk. In our ideal circumstances, you would glaze with egg yolk or egg. However, I know that eggs at the moment are really, really hard to get hold of. Although this is not ideal, milk has sugar in it, natural sugars, which will caramelise when it goes in the oven, and so it will actually make your pie go golden, which is good. And hopefully a tablespoon or less of milk is easier to find and get hold of and use than an egg. But if you've got the egg and you've got plenty, you do as you wish. That then can go onto a baking tray and into the oven, and that'll be ready about 30 to 40 minutes, but you need to make sure that the pie filling in the middle is piping hot and ready to eat. So that's going to go into the oven in a moment. However, the last little thing to say at this point in time is that we are trying desperately not to waste food or ingredients. So with any remaining pastry you might have, you can always turn these into jam tarts. I've just brought the pastry back together again. I'm going to roll it out again to about the thickness of a pound coin. I could fill some flour there. I'm just going to bring that in and use that on it. About the thickness of a pound coin. And you might think, oh, I might make pastry once. I might go for 150 grams of pastry, so I've got enough to make some jam tarts. Take your cutter. Now the cutter is ever so slightly bigger than the tray holes that that I'm going to be using, so you can see it fits around the outside plus a little bit extra. That will help the pastry to be able to go up the sides of this tin. You take your pastry, you cut out your piece, again about the thickness of a pound coin, using your tips of your fingers, very gently ease it into the bunting so that it is not left flat. You're then going to take some jam. Don't have a lot of jam left, but I'm going to hopefully have enough for this. You want about a teaspoon of jam. Don't be tempted to overfill them. I know supermarkets have jam tarts that literally are filled to the top. In my experience, jam will melt or dissolve, the sugar in the jam will melt and dissolve, it will bubble, the sugar in it will bubble up and go up and outside, and then you'll never get your jam tarts out of the bunting that they're in. So a teaspoon rather is more than enough, never go for more than that. These are going to go into the oven then, again probably about 180 gas mark 5 until the pastry is cooked through. It will probably be 15 to 20 minutes, but you'll need to have a little look and see where they're at. The easiest way to get jam tarts out of the trays is when they are still warm, so before the jam has had a chance to solidify and crust on there, is to get a tablespoon and just gently lift them out once they're cooked. But you need to do that when about 5 to 10 minutes after they come out of the oven, when they're still warm. Obviously the jam will stay hot for a very, very long time. Don't be tempted to eat them. Don't let any children touch the jam for a long time afterwards, because it does stay very hot for a very long time. I hope that was helpful. Okay, so after about 15 to 20 minutes I took the jam tarts out of the oven. As you can see on the base, they're nice and a little bit of colour on them. They're also quite crispy, they've not got a soggy bottom. I removed them from the tin while they were still warm. This one here had gone over the edges a little bit, and as that dries and cools down it will stick to the tin. To get any jam off the tin, if you put it into some hot soapy water, the heat from the water should help to melt the sugar, and hopefully then your tin will become clean. The chicken pie then's been in for about 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. As you can see, the pastry's got a really nice colour here, and as I start to cut it open you might just about be able to see the steam that's escaping from it, which tells me that this pie is cooked and hot on the inside. So I'll then just take a slice of the pie out and place it on a plate with some potatoes. So much veg in there today, there's not going to be any extra veg going in with that. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy.